Hello and warm welcome to everyone. I'm Ella Sackville from the Women's Forum editorial team, and I'd like to welcome you to the Women4AI session, Diversifying the Future, Gender and Inclusiveness Beyond AI. If you're just joining us this afternoon, some housekeeping notes. We will be taking as many audience questions as possible, and you can submit questions in the chat box on the right of your screen. Once the session ends, you'll find the next sessions by scrolling down on your screen. And in case you have to drop out at any point, all sessions will be recorded and can be available to view on the website later. I'd just like to say, please join the discussion on social media with the hashtags #Women4Inclusion, #WFG7, #Women4AI. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Chui to our lead our discussion. Michael is a partner at McKinsey Global Institute and leads the research on the impact of disruptive technologies and innovation on business, the economy, and society. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Ella. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's terrific to have you joining an amazing panel that we have today. I hope you're all safe, and I hope you'll find this interesting and inspiring. We're at a point in time when, first of all, AI was an incredible trend that had already happened, and then we find ourselves in the midst of this pandemic. These things coming together, I think, really presents a unique moment as we think about, the intersection of gender, the crisis, and AI at this point. And so with that, let me just start with Shelley from Microsoft. We know that you've been working on, the daring circle within the forum, as well as a number of things within the corporation. Can you talk a little bit about how AI, intersects with gender and the work that you've been doing in both contexts?
Sure. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening, maybe everyone around the world. It's quite early morning here in Seattle, and I'm really thrilled to be here. I apologize if the sun is kind of coming in over my head, but it's my pleasure to be able to talk about some of the work that we've been doing at the Women's Forum and at Microsoft. So if there are any folks on the call, and I assume there are, who were at our global forum in Paris in November, we launched some work there that was part of what we call the AI Daring Circle, one of the 4 daring circles of the forum. And that work is focused on the role of women in AI and how AI can empower women and how women can empower AI. And specifically, we made a call to action on behalf of a coalition of partners from organizations of all sizes and types around the world to include women and diverse viewpoints in development of AI to really mitigate the challenges of gender biases and other societal concerns. And for signatories to the call to explore opportunities for AI to address barriers to women's advancement in society. So since that launch, we've been really working on together to exchange best practices around how AI can be developed to help promote better inclusion. At Microsoft specifically, I have the pleasure of leading a team that includes the Office of Responsible AI, and we're focused on the responsible development and deployment of artificial intelligence across a number of different categories. And that, I'm happy to say, that office is run by a woman on my team, and a woman who is from New Zealand, so has a bit of a more diverse point of view on the world than we necessarily do here in Redmond, Washington. And really the goal of that group is to ensure that we're reducing things like bias and fairness. We have a committee on bias and fairness under a group we have called Ether, which is about the AI ethical principles in engineering. And they look at bias and fairness and how to ensure that when we're developing and deploying artificial intelligence, it's done with a lens of inclusion and specifically also a lens of gender. So I think more than ever, the work that we're doing in the Daring Circle, the work that we're doing together to ensure there's a gender lens on the development of AI is going to be so important as we go for an inclusive recovery in the midst of this pandemic.
Thank you. And I want to remind everyone out there that feel free to submit questions through the chat on the app as well. I want to pull on both threads. Shelley was talking about the ways in which AI is implemented, as well as its impact on the world, and also with the gender lens. Laura, I know at Lenovo that you've been trying to incorporate, these concerns and diversity into even the product development process. What are you doing there?
We have, Michael, thanks, and hello, everyone. Our tagline at Lenovo is smarter technology for all, and we think of all as really directively meaning accessibility for all. So we decided fairly early on in our AI journey that we needed to make sure as we develop products that they are based on diverse algorithms, that to the extent we're able, we can work bias out of those algorithms. And so we first set up a product development and diversity office, which is sort of the umbrella organization that launches initiatives associated with removing bias from our product development cycles. And specifically, we've put together what we call Diversity by Design project, which is sponsored by our COO and head of the PC business, the global head of HR, and myself. And the point of this is to incorporate a gender lens into our product development at the early stages. So this is our launch process. During launch of any product coming out of the PC business, we take a look at whether there's the potential for bias and whether a diversity lens does need to be applied. And there's a working team that's tasked to do that. We think ultimately this is perhaps a certification process for our own products, but also perhaps for third-party products. And so far, I'll give you an example. When we opened our new headquarters in Beijing about 12 to 14 months ago, we have an unaided store in the lobby which serves as a test center. And it was really important that we get the facial recognition in the store right, so that we're recognizing customers who are coming in and out and what they should be charged. And we found that the system was not recognizing African-American employees and visitors. And when we dove into that, we learned that the third-party algorithm that had been provided was really based on and developed through the recognition of Asian faces. So we immediately realized, oh my goodness, as we're developing these products and systems, we have to have the same sensitivity. So that was really what gave launch to the Diversity by Design initiative.
Terrific, thank you. Rahaf, you're a digital anthropologist. I'd love to, ask you, as you've gone about your work, how the ways in which products and services are designed, the representation of the people doing that work impacts, their design. I think Laura had a very interesting example there that had to do with the systems, the training data used for some of those AI systems. What are you seeing?
Hi, Michael. Thank you guys so much, and really looking forward to answering people's questions and comments. What I'm seeing is that the issue of bias is a lot more complicated and nuanced than we maybe think that it is. There's like a whole section of it, which Laura mentioned, which talks about the data sets, the programming team, and the assumptions that were made. I think there's also a deeper, more hidden bias in terms of the ideology itself that the technology has, how it thinks about performance, what it thinks the standards of success should be, how it categorizes, a good outcome. And especially when you look at metrics, I mean, metrics can be really advanced, but they're created upon a model of something that says this is what's important to measure. So in my work, especially now during the pandemic, we're looking at not just how the technology itself could be subject to biases, but how we as a people are looking at things like work and success and leadership, and what are those archetypes that we have just digitized. Many of the ways that we look at leadership, many of our ideas about leadership are actually quite old, but when we look at leadership metrics, we're using cutting edge technologies, but we maybe are referencing old ideologies that they might be revisited before we even start talking about data sets, which is also a very important thing. So it's like we need to, I'm really appreciating the nuanced conversation we need to have that often says we need to look at every technology and deep dive into what is this technology's worldview? What is this technology's ideology? What is this technology's future state that they're hoping to work towards? And is that future state aligned with the type of world that we want to live in or not?
Well, and that's right a bit. I mean, people sometimes, and I might say naively, view technology as not having an ideology. It's just a tool. Can you say more about how technology could have an ideology and what that might mean?
Yeah, sure. And I'll give you like a really quick example. So something like Twitter, for example. So Twitter is based on the idea that at some point somebody thought that exchanging information in short snippets was the preferred way, was a good way to communicate. And so this whole platform developed around the idea that we can exchange thoughts in a couple of sentences, 280 characters, right? Now, Twitter has evolved to become such a big part of the way that we communicate, the way that certain politicians communicate. And all of a sudden now we're starting to see that we're trying to discuss very complex ideas, immigration policy, security, AI biases, privacy, all of these things. And yet everyone is trying to do it in these like couple of sentences. So one, culturally, it begs the question, what happens when we lose our ability of deep diving into an idea and really understanding the profound impacts that that idea has? And then two, what happens when you get used to just skimming and scanning and giving people bite-sized information? And then what's funny is that people come back and they say, well, you know, Twitter solved that problem because now they have threaded replies. And it's like, well, congratulations, you just reinvented the paragraph. Like now we're just giving longer responses in a Twitter thread because we cannot discuss the idea in depth. So I worry about what getting used to, or what assuming that brevity is better, what that does to our capacity as an online community to discuss really complicated ideas.
Super interesting. Well, fortunately, we have a little bit of time here, more than 180 characters. Shelley, let me come back to you. Curious to the extent to which you're able to share the Office of Responsible Technology, what sorts of examples do you have there in terms of the ways that that's been able to shape the way that Microsoft designs products and services, particularly with regard to AI and gender?
Sure. So, I mean, the Office of Responsible AI runs a process that really, looks at, I think very similar to the Lenovo examples, looks at the uses of technology kind of as they're being developed and as they're being deployed to help provide guidance to engineering teams, sales teams, teams across the company that are using AI, whether it's with a customer, whether it's some kind of an internal tool, to help understand how is the technology going to be used, what are the underlying assumptions of the technology, what are all of the potential biases and other issues that could creep into the development or the deployment, because oftentimes you'll find certainly the technology itself is maybe unbiased, but then the use comes in on top of that. So you do have to be very thoughtful about how you review and look at these things. So that's what we do in the Office of Responsible AI. It's one of the key functions that we have. And when you think about specific examples, I think there's probably so many examples on the internet of different ways in which AI data sets can ultimately be biased and ultimately end up in the result being biased, whether it's the very good example about how words are used. When you look at how women are associated with words that are traditionally female, like nanny and housekeeper and nurse and receptionist, while men will be doctor and lawyer, those kinds of things. So trying to really root out some of the key causes of bias showing up ultimately in the way technology is used. And so that's one of the key things that we are responsible for doing, as well as ensuring that everyone in the company is trained on these issues so that we can start help spotting these issues as they come up. I mean, this is something that's really in many ways new for everyone. And that's why I think things like the daring circle and the call that we've done across multiple companies so that we can share those best practices and all learn a little bit more about what each other is doing so that we can then ourselves make everyone better. So that's kind of a long way to say, I think we're all still working on this challenge and we can all get better together. And there are just so many examples of ways that we can share those practices and really incorporate them in a bunch of different ways throughout the company.
Great, thank you. And maybe Laura and Shelley, a question has come in from our participants about the responsibility that the corporate world has to play, Lenovo, Microsoft, and others, in terms of showing daring leadership, promoting inclusivity, particularly gender equality. And then where does that intersect with public policy? So a lot of different stakeholders. Laura, why don't we start with you?
Sure, Michael. So I would have two responses. I think first, from the company's perspective, this responsibility is not only to the public, but to the shareholder. If our products don't reflect our customer set, then we won't be selling products and we won't have fulfilled our mission to our investors. So that's the company response. I think the pandemic has cast a spotlight on our commitment to the community, which I was sharing the example with you earlier. Lenovo built out the infrastructure at the coronavirus hospitals in Wuhan, the data centers, the servers, the PCs, et cetera, et cetera. And in doing that, we had the opportunity to see that we were serving a very diverse set of customers, not only the healthcare workers, but the patients themselves. And it just reminds us that we are dealing in a diverse world, a gender diverse world, a race diverse world, a ability diverse world. And it's really imperative that our products take that into account and are designed for that multifaceted use set.
Shelley, other thoughts from you in terms of the role of the corporate world?
Yeah, I agree. We're kind of in many ways, at the base of it. But it is, I think you also asked, like, what is the role of other stakeholders? And I think we all have a role to play in this. This isn't something that one company or one government can do by itself. It's something that we have to all work together for. And I would just to kind of add, there are also, we've touched on this a little bit, there are also so many other issues that go beyond just sort of AI and gender, and that's inclusion generally. When you think about the opportunity that we have as companies to either empower people or disempower people as we roll out technology, that's why our responsibility is so great. In one moment, as a technology company, if you ship a product that's unaccessible or that causes some kind of concern, you have the potential to really disempower people, and that's certainly not what our mission is about. It's about empowering people. So that's why it's so important to take this so seriously. And one of the other programs that I work on that I think is so fundamental to this, and so much that we see in the pandemic, is really connectivity. Because ultimately, as we're learning, as we knew, but as we're seeing through this pandemic, is that if you're not connected, your opportunity is significantly impacted. And of course, that disproportionately impacts women and other disenfranchised people. So, for us, you really have to take a layered approach. It's not just about gender. It's not just about accessibility. It's like all of these different factors that come together to empower people. And if you focus on women, oftentimes you can solve a lot for a lot of different people, but you do have to look and ensure that you're looking across the spectrum of inclusion.
Real briefly, what are you doing on the connectivity side? What sorts of efforts are underway there?
Sure. We have a program called Airband, and that's about connecting the world's unconnected people. We work with, again, not only Microsoft cannot do this. We work with a group of internet service provider partners to help extend networks. In the COVID crisis specifically, we've been working to help set up very quick hotspots, roll out networks absolutely as quickly as we can with our partners, so that we can get not only the long-term connectivity, but really some short-term connectivity solutions in place. And there's also a couple of programs that are specifically about women. The White House has a Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative that we're working with in partnership with USAID to further incorporate gender inclusion in our partners' connectivity efforts. And so, things like getting connectivity so that we can deliver STEM education to women, which I know is a topic that we're talking about today at the Women's Forum.
Great. Rahaf, let me turn to you and segueing off a point that Shelley made, which is, it's one thing to prevent harm, to reduce bias. And this is a question that has come in from another one of our participants. But what is it that, the responsible, inclusive use of AI can do to actually advance women's equality, advance women's roles in society?
Well, I kind of think there's like 2 points that we have to consider. The first is that the technology that we're using is simply reflecting back a lot of the issues or challenges that we face in the real world. So there's really no point or not no point, but I find it really difficult to talk about what can AI do specifically if we're not actually tackling real life lack of diversity in hiring, in salary payment, and the recognition of a lot of the unpaid, unrecognized labor that many women are doing right now. I mean, one of the biggest things that we have seen in this pandemic is that women are bearing the brunt of making sure that, you know, the kids are doing their online schooling and that everything is kind of being taken care of. And those are the types of implications that we're not going to see the results of for maybe a couple of years, right? But they're being felt right now. So whenever we get into conversations about technology, I always like to say, okay, well, let's just take a second, put the technology aside, and let's look at the real world gaps that we have to work towards. Because if we prioritize that as a market, as consumers, as governments, as societies, the technology will follow. And it's a bit of a harsh message, but I believe that the technology always reflects market priorities. So if it's not being reflected in the technology, it's because on some level, the market doesn't value it enough. And the second thing is, I think much to Shelley's point when she was talking about stakeholders, is that we also have a responsibility as consumers to be careful in what tools and what technologies that we use. I always ask people when I talk to clients or when I talk at events, I always ask people to raise their hands if they have fully read and fully understand the terms and services of all of the technology services that they're subscribed to. And nobody really raises their hands unless I'm talking to like, you know, IP lawyers or lawyers or something. But what does this say about us that we are willing to scroll by, you know, pages and pages of technology that's laying out, you know, privacy concerns, diversity concerns, AI concerns, and we don't even take the time to read it? Like, I think it's very unfair for consumers to just point fingers at organizations when they have to also be active participants. This is a strategy. If you want to move towards inclusivity, this is a strategy that has to be supported by consumers, by companies, and by governments. No one party can do it alone. And the last thing I will say is that I think it also goes back to defining what is important, that you can't just have companies now that are saying we're doing really innovative stuff, we're creating really innovative tools. Well, if that definition of innovation doesn't have diversity, transparency, sustainability, and ethics baked into it, then it shouldn't be considered innovative. And, you know, that way you won't have companies that create really cool tools and then they come back and they say, oops, we've accidentally, you know, broken journalism. We've broken informed information consumption. We've broken democracy. It's like, if our definition of innovation has those metrics, it has to be sustainable, it has to be transparent, it has to be inclusive, then I think that would give us a much better sense of what is actually innovative and what's taking us in a direction that we want to go.
Michael, if I may, you know, one of the interesting metrics or measures of gender involvement in innovation is patent filings. And in the US, years ago when I was at Kodak, we found, at the time that Kodak was a major research organization, we found that less than 2% of our named inventors on patent applications were women. And we set about trying to change that. Now, advanced another decade and a half later, the US Patent and Trademark Office is extremely focused on this issue. And we're working with that organization to make sure that within Lenovo, we have very diverse research teams. Innovation can never lead to accessible products unless the innovators themselves are a diverse set.
That's super interesting. Shelley, in your organization and in your work broadly, how do you think about representation in the technical fields? It's certainly been a challenge in the engineering side as an industry.
Yeah, there is absolutely no doubt it is a challenge, and it will continue to be a challenge for some time in the future. You know, and it's through forums like this that we really can talk about the issues and start focus more and more on the issues. I think, you know, at Microsoft, we're incredibly focused on recruiting a diverse workforce. You know, we, like many other companies in the industry, you know, have had our own challenges with gender and recruiting and, you know, and inclusion, importantly, as we bring women on board and bring women through the pipeline. So you have to really attack it not just on STEM and girls, which is an incredibly important component, but you have to see people all the way through the life cycle up to the senior leadership ranks. Ensure that you're not losing women along the way, as you know, as typically happens. many times your numbers will fall off as women enter the childbearing years and are tasked with many more of the responsibilities at home. So we work as a company, and we also work with peers to share best practices around how do we ensure that that the work environment works for women, and through that, generally, it also helps the work environment. What I always say is work for people who have these responsibilities. It kind of helps everyone, bring everyone along if you're helping to solve for women, and not just working part-time, which has been kind of the old traditional, like, oh, we're helping people work part-time, that's enough. We definitely want to focus on how do we help people work full-time in a way that that works and helps. If you want to work part-time, you can work part-time, but if you want to work full-time, I want to make sure that we're able to do that and really bring people through all of those years of work and through the pipeline up to senior leadership of the company.
Another question has come in from one of our participants, actually at the UC Berkeley Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership. What sorts of training programs, Shelley, you were talking about the professional development of colleagues in the company. What sorts of programs, formal or informal, can be put in place in order to ensure that bias is taken into account, throughout everything that's going on?
Yeah. So when you specifically think of like bias training, we do things like around, I forget the name of the training, but there's basically looking at micro, what is it called? Micro inequities. Essentially the idea that, over time, like you die a death of 1,000 cuts if it's not, you're not being directly, certainly direct attacks on people, but sort of over time as, words that are used, as people are interacting, how do you bring people along? So we have a lot of different trainings that are focused on eliminating bias in the workplace and promoting a culture of inclusion, which I think is really kind of the other way to talk about it. And we train across the company. We have leader-led training in many cases, and we also have professional training that we deploy. So we have a ton of examples, and then specifically focused on women, we do things like mentoring rings. We do things like professional development that's targeted at women, and particularly we have some development that's targeted at women of color who face even more concerns than just women generally. Our women of color population, we're really trying to help bring that population along. I think it's incumbent upon us as women leaders to ensure that the door is open behind us. And so one of the things that I personally do, and that I encourage my peers that are in leadership positions to do, is to make sure that we are working to help women in the department and in the company come along. So open the door of opportunity behind you. Don't let it shut as you pass through.
Laura, any additional thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, I'll raise my hand again, Michael, and follow on Shelley's comments to say I was particularly pleased in our organization when we began to roll out training that was pandemic specific and working from home specific. Our women leaders at Lenovo organization, our WIL organization, rolled out a module specifically for women and the unique challenges that we are facing in the pandemic. Everything from what do you do when you don't have broadband connectivity to what do you do when your kid is using your PC for online learning, to how do you present yourself over Zoom. And so we had an incredible uptake. I think people appreciated that we were listening and understanding that there are unique problems out there that need to be solved for people to be effective. And so I was really excited that happened very quickly.
Thank you. And we have a set of very senior leaders in their corporations here. Rahaf, I know that you had some reflections on leadership and some of the deeper issues. Did you care to share some of those thoughts that you had, those insights that you had on that topic?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I also think just to definitely emphasize Shelley and Laura's points that when you also look at inclusivity around technology, sometimes I mean, I personally believe that tech teams have to also have a lot of people with non-tech backgrounds. And I think that we need to start including, you know, historians and artists and writers and creatives and psychologists and all these other fields, because when you focus so much on technical competency, you end up creating a skill set that exists in a vacuum and that is nowhere linked to issues of humanity, you know, to empathetic technology, to empathetic leadership. If everything is just about, well, coding this that way and making this thing, then as I always say, you have a generation of really brilliant minds that can, you know, that know how to code, but they don't really know like what to code or why to code. And I think the broader conversation is that there is an opportunity for collaboration even outside of just technology fields. And I had a client that once said to me, well, we can't find women with the technical skill sets in order to join our, you know, our technical team. And I said, so hire them from other industries and bring them in anyway. Like, you know, adding perspective isn't just about technical competency at that level. What I will say is, like, during the pandemic, I don't have the answer to this, but it's something that I've been reflecting on, is that there's been a lot of news about how certain countries with women leaders have fared a little bit better. And the term that I've heard over and over is compassion and empathy. And I thought that was really interesting, because I think that when you look at the history of how the traditional archetype of the modern leader has evolved, we pulled a lot from like military strategy, we pulled a lot from the Industrial Revolution. The characteristics of that leader was supposed to be somebody who, you know, could beat the competition and who could you know, like defend and conquer. And it was this very sort of strong type of leadership. There's nothing wrong with that type of leadership. I'm just saying that is sort of the archetype that we've pulled. And we're finding that as we become more connected globally, that what we really need is leadership that emphasizes collaboration and compassion and just adding more of those elements. And so I started asking myself, well, what would the AI metrics look like? And what would the data look like if we started to prioritize empathy? Like, what would that be? What would we be measuring? What would we be looking for? How would we be evaluating leaders as they move through their organization? And I don't have the answers to that, but I would argue that the vast number of metrics that are developed now were developed to support a very specific type of leadership where, you know, you wanted to be rational and hyper focused on the numbers, and it was all about the numbers and the story and the facts. And again, that's not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying I wonder if there was another perspective we can add to that toolkit, so when we take decisions, it's not just numbers. Because I think, as we've seen during this pandemic, we're hearing horrifying numbers. We're hearing unemployment in the millions. We're hearing, and on some level, like, I sometimes have a hard time connecting with the abstractness of these numbers. Hundreds of thousands of people dead. I don't even know how to emotionally process that. So how can we make sure that we're not losing our humanity, our proximity to each other, our connection with each other, as we try to tackle bigger and bigger data sets, when at some point, like, the numbers are going to be meaningless? And if they're meaningless, then how can they be connected to empathetic decision-making and empathetic leadership?
Mm-hmm. Can I jump in there? Oh,
Shelley.
Yeah, you know, I just think that point is so important, because as we think about AI and as, you know, computers are making decisions that are, you know, more decisions about people, it's no longer a question only of what can technology do. It's a question of what should technology do. And that's why it's so important that this multidisciplinary approach that you've pointed out is a key part of what we're focused on. And I always think, like, I am so glad that it's not only about the engineers making the decisions. And I love engineers, and they're incredibly important, but all of us that have studied the liberal arts and humanities can now breathe a deep collective sigh of relief that, you know, our viewpoint is incredibly important as computers start to act more like humans, that people who have studied the humanities and the liberal arts are involved in the process. And what I also love about this is that actually is often women. Women overwhelmingly study these types of disciplines. And so our role in creating the future of technology has grown exponentially with the advancement of technology in artificial intelligence.
I would just add, I think the point that Rahaf makes is really important, because we know that the so-called soft skills are not the strong suit of AI. AI, it's probably the biggest gap, right? AI and computational learning are very removed from empathy and compassion and emotional intelligence. And so I think you point exactly to the greatest challenge that needs to be solved in the context of AI. If I could pivot a moment to another point, I want to acknowledge the Women's Forum's role in suggesting initiatives to the G7. And I am particularly impressed with the notion of research tax credits and perhaps ranking of companies that do take measures to incorporate gender thinking into the development of AI. I think, you know, I'm a strong believer in the motto of what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And so bringing some of these metrics to bear in the field of AI development, I think will be tremendously important on a global basis in order to succeed at bridging the gap between the soft skills and the computational power of AI.
Thank you. Look, we've had another question come in from one of the participants, and I know we're rapidly coming to the end of the session, but we'd love to get this in. This actually comes from one of the largest financial institutions in the world. As we move to more remote work, and Laura, you made reference to this a little bit, how do we make sure that women's voices are represented, you know, in this new way of working? I don't know who would like to go, but feel free to jump in if you have a reflection there.
Well, I'll just give an example that I know I shared yesterday, I think, in the justice system. So I'll put my legal hat on now and say that we know in the US, as courts have gone online, women who are advocates in one way or another are not necessarily accommodated in their scheduling, their access, et cetera. And so that's pointed to a huge, if this is a model that will continue to some extent, we have to be sensitive to the fact that we have to give access to the people who are play a role in the justice system. And so a number of general counsel in the US have written to various judicial leaders to suggest that this is a sensitivity we've now become very aware of because of the pandemic. It doesn't answer the question, it just points to an example of the problem.
Great. All right, in the remaining time, I want to do just a quick lightning round. Same question for all of you. Let me start with Shelley, with you, and I'll ask Laura and Rahaf as well. This is titled G7 Call to Action. Moment with the G7 leaders. What would you recommend that they do? Shelley, go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna switch that question up a little bit on you, because I'm gonna say the call to action I have for people who are listening to this cast. I would say, please go to the website to check out the call to action for the Daring Circle and get your company to sign up to it.
Laura.
Well, I think I've answered the question already. I think putting metrics in place. I don't think compounding the legal framework is necessary to drive diversity in AI, but I think metrics that measure the performance of companies' involvement in that journey are important.
Rahaf.
I think that you can't talk about technology without talking about culture. And I would emphasize that if you're gonna, you know, as much effort as you put in understanding the technology specifications, we have to put into understanding the stories that we're telling about these technologies, the roles in their lives, and what is important, because those things are gonna be far more impactful than the technology itself, which is neutral. It's how we apply it that's gonna make a difference.
Terrific. Well, thank you all. I know that we could keep on going for much longer, but there are other topics to cover, and I want to appreciate all the insights that you've shared with us.